I walked into this with a tremendous amount of insecurity that I didn't know was there until the pressure cooker squeezes it out. I didn't know how insecure I was until I stood on the platform to communicate after our church had been listening to that guy for a while. I will never forget the first time that he asked me to preach at North Point. And, I heard the stories of people being, chewed up and spit out by that platform and that stage. And I get it. It's because of our own insecurities. It's not because of anything else. But I mean, my first Sunday that I did that, they gave me a mic pack and it had Andy's name still on it. And I was like, I do not need any more reminders, But I will tell you,
mic pack, it's so intimidating.
Isn't it craziness? And but I remember that first Sunday, Carey, in all vulnerability, man. I so remember preaching at North Point, and gosh, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people hear that, because of their broad reach. And I only really cared about one person hearing the message, who was, by the way, already going to heaven. And it didn't even matter that he heard it, but all I cared about was, what is Andy going to think?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, I am so glad you joined us today. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. And if you enjoyed today's episode, leave a comment as well. Well, today I sit down with Gavin Adams, and we talk about why leading a church is harder than leading a business and a whole lot of other things. Gavin was a young leader when he started ministry and saw explosive growth, like a few hundred to 8,000 people. We go through that entire journey and a whole lot more. And today's episode is brought to you by the Art of Leadership Academy. So this is something I started 2 years ago that I would love for you to join. You can keep learning from your own mistakes, or what if you actually fast track your growth and learn directly from people who have been in your shoes before, including me. I'm active in the Art of Leadership Academy live almost every day each week, and it's truly me. It's not a bot, it's not AI or a team member. It's me, and I'd love to connect with you. You can learn more and join today and start growing your leadership at theartofleadershipacademy.com. Leave worrying and agonizing in the past, because it's time to start growing as a leader. It's time for your church to start growing too. Well, another question for you. Has there ever been a more distracting time to be alive? Subsplash puts the best of today's technology in the hands of churches, and to help you break through the noise and actually make disciples, they want to help you out. So you can go to subsplash.com/Carey and you'll get $500 off when you sign up. And now to today's conversation with Gavin Adams. Gavin, it's good to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Hey, Carey, good to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, we had the chance to work together for a number of years, sort of in the same church network. And you had a really interesting journey. So I think we met around the time that you were charged with taking over a church that had really been struggling. And they were down to the last few dollars in the bank account. Can you just describe the situation that you kind of walked into? And when was that? Was that 2007?
It was November of 2008. My first Sunday, my first summer, November 16th, 2008. You're right. I know the term now is called revitalization. I did not know that at the time, but that is exactly what it was. I had been blessed. I spent a decade in the marketplace and transitioned into ministry and got to help plant a church, technically bivocational, but there's no such thing as really.
Yeah. And what were you doing in the marketplace?
I grew up in the local church, loved Jesus, loved the church, but had no intent in working in ministry. So I had a marketing degree and an MBA in marketing. I was doing consulting and kind of running a marketing agency, basically. But at the same time, feeling, man, I could not get enough of volunteering in middle school ministry at a church. And eventually I realized that was God kind of pulling me back into ministry. And of course, I had no idea if I could even work at a church with a business background. So it took a little bit of time to figure those steps out, but eventually I did. And so I got to help plant a church. But 3 years into that, went to Watermark Church. It was called Watermark back then. It's called Woodstock City Church now. But Carey, that's when we probably first met back in that time. And so, in hindsight, how this is. In hindsight, you look back and you think, what was I thinking? But in the moment, you feel that it's what's God's calling you to do. So we took kind of what actually is probably considered a big leap at this point. But in hindsight, it just felt like the obvious thing to do. Right in the moment, it felt like it was the easy thing to go do. So took over a church that I was the third lead pastor in the first 3 years of the church. So lots of turmoil, lots of change. I mean, you name it, right? Not a lot of great things, but a lot of really great potential with great people. My first Sunday, I do remember though, we had $400 in the bank and maybe 200 people, which actually is a pretty good size. But that was a lot less than it started. It had more to begin with, but just throughout the leadership transitions, a lot of the people obviously had left.
So that happened. Let's talk, because we have marketplace leaders listening who love the church. And once in a while, I don't get it a lot, but once in a while, someone will say, how do I know I'm called into ministry? How did that happen for you? Can you break that down?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that for a second. The answer is that it took me taking a lot of incremental steps to figure this out. I knew that I was called to be involved in ministry. When I was running our business and it was successful, I didn't love it because I enjoyed ministry so much. But I thought for a while maybe being just generous to the local church was what God had positioned us to do, and so we did that, and was involved in lots of campaign teams, and was an elder at a church.
I was going to say, you would have made the classic board member. Right?
Yeah, that's me. That's what I was.
Successful in business.
Yeah.
You can help fund things. You can volunteer.
Correct.
I mean, you would be the poster child for a great board member.
I didn't know that at the time, but after I became a pastor, I was exactly that for those pastors. And so, and met every week, every other week to talk strategy and to talk church, and and just helped as much as I could in any way I could. At the same time, kept feeling this pull to do more. And I got some incredible advice from the associate pastor at the church where I was serving at. He said that he had a similar experience. He had come out of the marketplace a decade or so prior. And the advice that he got, which he was passing on to me, was to take incremental steps further and further in until the tension subsided. And when that tension went away, you've gone to the place where maybe God was calling. So that's exactly what I did, Carey. I started teaching every Wednesday night at the middle school environment. I started being more involved in different ministry spaces, incrementally taking steps in to the point where I decided, I outsourced the majority of my business so I could be more involved in the day-to-day. I got to a point where the only next step was to go onto some sort of staff role, and decided to do that. But that was the biggest leap. But up until that point, it was incremental steps, adding a little bit more over time to decide, how much would be enough, basically. And for me, it turned out full time was what it led to.
Isn't that interesting? I've never heard that test. And yet it resonates. Keep going forward until the tension releases. And for you, it never really released.
Yeah. I really loved the, it was that holy discontentment, right, is the phrase that we'd like to use for that. There was a holy discontentment that I knew would be resolved eventually. I just didn't know what it was going to take to resolve it. And, Carey, you know me pretty well. I'm not like a sit back, be patient type of guy. When I feel that discontentment, I'm like, let's change everything right now. Let's fix it. But the reality is that you can't fix problems like that with one decision. It was a series of incremental steps. I really do feel like it's like a staircase or a ladder, and you just take one step at a time and see how you feel. Sit for a minute in it, see how things are going. And these are life-changing decisions. These aren't small decisions. So, to take those, and of course, we never want to make big decisions in emotional seasons or moments. And this was emotional. It felt emotional. And so just slow down that pace a little bit and take it at a pace that I could process what I was feeling, process what I was doing, really examine the step as I took it, and recognize if the tension was going away or not. And for me, it just took a step all the way in before I knew that I had arrived.
So there was no like angel at the foot of the bed, no dramatic moment, anything like that.
And of course, I think we all say we wish that would be easier, yet it would be a lot more accountability with that. So, yeah.
So did you get involved with another church before you got involved with Watermark / Woodstock City?
Yeah. So the church that I was an elder or whatever, and highly involved in student ministry as a lay pastor or hey, and just really quick back to your first question, I even during a hiring process stepped in when we were looking to hire a middle school pastor during a transition, became the lay pastor over middle school as an elder for a season. Just to help keep things moving forward that I had helped build with the previous guy who had transitioned into another role. So again, that was just another step, right? So yeah, so at that church, Heritage Christian Church, they're called One Church now, got to be a part of that. But then a guy that you know as well, Chris Patton, was launching Southside Church. It was a partnership church of North Point Ministries way back in the early days when they just had started that idea. That's right. And so through some very cool kind of God-ordained really moments, conversations, found out about this new church that was starting 10 minutes away from the church that we were so heavily involved in. Went to a small group that he was leading one night just to kind of meet Chris, meet the team. I think I probably annoyingly asked Chris question after question after question about the church. And I didn't know anything about North Point at the time. I just heard about this new church that was starting. And I'm an entrepreneurial kind of guy, so new was exciting. And so we spent an hour with me pinging him about this new church. And we walked away, Carey, and thought, my wife and I thought, I think this is what we should lean into, So their first Sunday, I taught middle school at the church that we were a part of. Left after the 9 o'clock service, went to the 11 o'clock service at Southside Church, sat in for that service. I think I can say within 60 seconds of the service starting, I looked at Chantel, my wife, and said, I think this is where we should be. Because we did have clarity on that. God was very clear that this is something that it was speaking to us in a way that we just felt like it would be beneficial for our family, but also for us if we could benefit this new startup. And so we did that, and then came on staff, I think, with Chris as a part-time bivocational middle school pastor, probably a month later.
That's right. You were one of Chris's guys. I forgot.
That's right. That was my first foray. And I tell Chris all the time, he took a risk on me. I did not know how to be a pastor. I did not know how to do any of those things. He just saw a guy who was excited and passionate about the local church. And he probably knew I was willing to work really hard, but he took a risk and gave me an opportunity. And it led to everything else that I've been able to do in ministry, which I'm so grateful for him for that.
I'm glad we kind of went down this path because this is, in the mid 2000s that all of this happened. But think about some mutual friends, past podcast guests. Jeff Henderson, very similar.
Love Jeff. Yep.
I love Jeff.
Yep.
I mean, for 20 years, came from the Atlanta Braves and Chick-fil-A.
That's right.
Felt like, I think I need to go into ministry. Started Buckhead Church, which became, 8,000 people under his leadership. And then went to Gwinnett Church, similar story there, scaled it. And now he's back at Chick-fil-A.
That's right.
Which is awesome. Frank Beeler. Do you hang out with Frank? Do you know him well?
I don't hang a lot with Frank, but we've met, we know each other, we've spoken, yes.
Exactly. Frank, very similar story where Stephen Furtick, he just got involved, was selling insurance in his 20s, and Stephen Furtick kept tapping him on the shoulder. And then finally, he's like, all right, I'm coming on staff. Ended up running their kids ministry.
Yes.
Now is the CEO of the Faith Center, et cetera, or the founder of the Faith Center.
Yes.
And what that reminds me of, and this is why I'm glad we kind of went down this role, is you have sat on both sides of the fence.
Correct.
And one of my secret missions in life, I have a bunch, but one of them is to help bridge the divide between pastors and business leaders. And my theory is business leaders get intimidated by pastors and pastors get intimidated by business leaders. In part, business leaders are worried because they don't have the theological education. They're like, you're going to ask me how my prayer life is? Because I pray, but I'm not like you. And then pastors are like, well, you make money. Like that's intimidating. That's weird.
Yeah.
So if you're advising pastors listening to this, do you think that there is gifting left on the table because we're afraid to challenge business leaders?
Good grief, yes. I think one of the best things that happened for me walking into ministry was having sat on the other side for a decade. I sat on the other side of coffees where they would slide the little sheet over the pyramid of giving and ask you to,
where do you see yourself?
Yeah. And could God move you 2 levels higher? I sat and I never said this out loud, but as a marketplace guy, I thought no real successful marketplace person is sitting on the other side of this manipulative moment and not seeing through every bit of it. I mean, right? So I'm a pretty bold person by nature, which is I've had to learn to deal and tone that down when necessary. But I'll tell you what, using and toning that up in these conversations with business leaders and successful people is important. I tell leaders all the time in the church, if you're sitting across from someone, be unbelievably bold. And here's why, Carey. If they say no, that's okay. The worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to say, no, I don't really feel led to do that. The best thing that's going to happen is that you're going to give them an opportunity to participate in the kingdom in a way that they never thought they would be able to or even knew was possible. Can I just give you a really quick story on this?
Please.
We were doing a big capital campaign effort to build our first permanent structure. We were portable for, 7 years of my tenure before we moved into a building. And so I had a Bible study, had some guys in the Bible study. One of them was pretty new Christian. He was very immature in his faith. I didn't know much about his business, but I learned enough to know that he was very successful. And I don't, mean that in a bad way, but when you go to his house and you see his pool and you see the cars he's driving, seemed like he was doing all right,
Either a lot of debt or a lot of money.
There was something, and listening to him talk about what he's doing, I didn't understand it, but it seemed really profitable. So
when you have a good job, you can't explain
right.
it to people.
Exactly right. So he and I sat together and we were trying to raise, a lot of money in a kind of private phase thing for some matching, funds. And I sat with him one day, explained the entire project to him, explained everything we were doing. He had never given to a church before. And I asked him to fund half of the matching fund, which was well over $1 million. And I told him, I said, hey, I know this is insane, but I also know that you can probably do this. And I don't know outside of your family what you're going to spend money on that will be more important than this or will have a better guaranteed ROI than this. And I said, so I just want you to think about it. Well, he came back 2 weeks later and said, I can't do, over $1 million, but I can do, and he gave me a massive number. I think he might have given, $100 had I just treated him and given him a pledge card, and he's doing well into the 6 figures because I was bold and I just asked. I had other people though that I asked and they didn't do all of that. And that's okay. In fact, I would tell them all the time, Carey, I want you to know about this because if you don't know about it, you won't have an opportunity to participate in it. If you know about it, it gives you an opportunity. But if you don't feel led to do it, it's totally okay. And it won't affect our relationship, our friendship, but shame on me if I'm the one not telling you about it. So I want you to know.
No, the reason I wanted to bring that up is because, I think about you, I think about Jeff, you think about Chris Patton, you think about so many of the people who were on the ground floor. That was a year after I planted Connexus Church.
Right.
There were a lot of leaders that David McDaniel, the OG, the gangster, was pulling in. I love David. He's been on this podcast and haven't talked to him in so many years. But again, business background. And he recruited a lot of business leaders to become pastors and was very, very good at that and spoke their language. And we saw explosive growth, explosive growth. Same at Watermark/Woodstock City, where, what was it, 8,000 by the time you left? Like it was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, our, Easter and all that aside, our normal was 6,000 to 8,000, probably. It was a lot. David's a great example though of this. And back to your point about the pastor and the business guy, I think a lot of business people who are kingdom minded, I think we tend to all see things so binary where we aren't sure that you can be a part of something if you're not all in. So if you want to be in the kingdom work, you got to work at the church, and that's so untrue, right? Business people, business leaders have so much value to add in a local church. and not necessarily by volunteering in the parking lot. I mean, sure, you can do those things, but being on advisory teams, being a mentor, a leadership mentor for the leaders in the local church, they need that help and support. Leading a local church, as you know, Carey, is so complicated. It's so challenging. And unlike the marketplace where, again, everybody who's being paid is technically a volunteer, they could always leave. But at a church, you've got a congregation of people who are all volunteering to be a part of this. You're building an organization primarily off of volunteers. It's just a unique leadership challenge. And as you know, most seminaries and the education that pastors get, they're not walking in prepared for that level of leadership, right? They've been taught theology, exegesis, some of these things, and now you're having to herd cats of volunteers and recruit people to something, and keep them engaged. It's so challenging. So business leaders have such an important part to play outside of just the financial sides.
Which did you find more challenging? Scaling a business or scaling a church? Leading a church, leading a business?
Yeah, leading a church I found more challenging. I found, and not to be weird, theology stuff, but the reality, Chris Patton told me this. When I was working for Chris, I was still leading a business and then working with Chris full time, because I couldn't get enough of it. But Chris told me when I was leaving to go become the lead pastor, he said, the target's about to get a lot bigger. The challenges are about to get a lot tougher. I've told Chris this in hindsight. I told him, when he told me that, I looked and smiled and agreed. And then I thought internally, yeah, that's, I'm sure that's your story because you're not as good of a leader. And a month into my time at Watermark, I called Chris and said, I had no idea how right you were. When I was working in the marketplace, I don't know that the enemy, I'm sure the enemy cared. I don't think he cared that much. You lead a church, the target gets so much bigger. I don't know that I had a single time I preached for the first year that somebody didn't have a stomach virus or a cold or, you know what I mean? There's just so much extracurricular going on. The expectations are so much worse for pastors than I think marketplace leaders. We know some pretty senior, big time marketplace leaders. So I've never sat in a Fortune 100 CEO seat. So maybe I'm speaking out of a place I don't understand, but
that's literally 100 people in the world. So,
right. I know. You know what I'm saying?
Like literally.
But
so I don't think you're wrong.
I ran a business and, my customers had expectations, but they weren't like the congregations. I tell you what, I never once had a customer ask me to step into a tragedy and guide them and be the hands and feet of Jesus and maybe be the representation of God in their life during a tragedy and preside over a funeral. It's a lot more challenging.
Well, and if you think about it, you did a really good job setting up the dichotomy that we have in church leadership today, Gavin. You come from an undergrad straight into seminary, and what do you end up with? Trained in exegesis, you know how to parse Greek verbs, but it's like, how do I lead a board? How do I raise money? How do we do a building project? How do I manage staff, right?
Yeah. What is a P&L? What's all
a P&L?
Of that stuff?
How do I reach new people? Like, obviously just standing behind a pulpit or on a stage doesn't do it. What else do I need to do? You don't have the practical skills in business. No. You often figure out those issues of scale and P&Ls and people and HR and cold calls, all of that stuff, but you don't have the theological backing.
That's right.
That comes along.
You think about the local church, the mission of every local church. We put different words to it, but we're trying to, achieve the Great Commission. We're trying to be evangelistic and discipleship in nature, and that's strategy. We don't call it that, but the reality is that discipleship is nothing more than a journey that people are taking step by step by step, and it's our job as church leaders to create the most conducive space environment for people to take those steps, to inspire, encourage them, and kind of hold their hand as they do. That's a strategy conversation. I think the best educational space I experienced for leading a local church was in my business strategy courses in my undergrad and my MBA program. I learned more about that, and learned more about how to think strategically that got transitioned into the local church through that than I did the seminary degrees.
Yeah. And how did you backfill the theological aspect when you felt a call into ministry? Or did you? Let's be honest. One of the poorly kept secrets in the church world is a lot of people never got the training. So what did you do? And it's okay if that's your story too.
No, of course it is. And I think it is okay if that's your story, because you can backfill that in a lot of different ways, right? You don't have to have letters after your name to have learned a lot and studied really hard. Yeah. I did decide to go back to seminary, mostly because I didn't have any training in that. And I'm really wanting to grow, not just as a leader, but I wanted to grow as a pastor and as a preacher. I did a lot of communication in the marketplace, but I also, and in the church too, but I wanted to feel like I don't know, the burden of doing that well. And I just didn't want to assume I understood biblical theology and so forth without having actually done the hard work to ensure that I was communicating it correctly. So I went to seminary afterwards while I was serving as lead pastor, probably 2 or 3 years in. And then went and did my doctorate as well. I guess I finished that at 2020. But yeah, I saw lots of guys who didn't have it and that were very successful. And at the same time, I just wasn't sure I trusted myself enough to do that. And you know, there's some insecurity in that in me that maybe others don't struggle with. But I didn't feel as confident standing up and teaching without having that background and that training. So for me, it just helped give me more confidence.
Well, I should say, for context, for people who don't know your situation as well as I do, you had a bit of an advantage too, because you weren't preaching 45 Sundays a year. You were a video church, a North Point partner.
That's right.
So you had Andy and the whole teaching team, and you ended up communicating a lot more down the road.
Correct.
But early on, you could literally just hit play.
Yes.
And you know, and that's
35, times a year I'm hitting play. Of course, as you know, the other problem is the other 15 times in those early days, I'm standing up following Andy. And
yes, I've lived that world.
So I even more reason I wanted to get more theological trained and all that, But yeah, you're right. If I was doing it 35, 45, 50 times a year out of the gate, I don't even know how. I don't know how anybody does that.
All right, so let me ask you this. Again, all questions not on the form I sent you ahead of time. But I remember the first time we played Andy Stanley at our church, and it was before we were a partner church. We were actually pre-Connexus in the previous iteration of the churches here. And I remember he was one of the best communicators I'd ever heard in my life. And I put him up thinking, I hope this is Insecure me 20 years ago. Hope people like me better. And eventually I started playing a regular diet, and it's like, I can't hold a candle to him, et cetera. How did you deal? I had to learn how to deal with that insecurity. And I'm not saying I got good at it, but I got far more comfortable. How did you handle that? Because that is intimidating. And pick your favorite preacher. All right. Pick somebody that you really admire and you think is tremendously gifted. And then you're up next to that person. How did you get over that personal insecurity?
Tell you what, I don't know what you're talking about. I had no trouble with, man, there's not a single one of us that has worked directly, with or, with Andy and all that, who I don't think has had to work through that. And most of us would say lots of counseling is the answer. That's my answer. But, it's interesting.
And he's not, to be fair, Andy's never trying to be intimidating.
No. He's as helpful and as kind as he could possibly be about that stuff.
He just is sometimes because he's so good.
That's part of Andy's problem, is I don't think he sees himself as good as he actually is. And so therefore, I think sometimes as leaders, we do forget that we have the weight we carry, right?
Yep.
For me, honestly, I walked into this with a tremendous amount of insecurity that I didn't know was there until the pressure cooker squeezes it out. I didn't know how insecure I was until I stood on the platform to communicate after our church had been listening to that guy for a while. I will never forget the first time that he asked me to preach at North Point. And, I heard the stories of people being, chewed up and spit out by that platform and that stage. And I get it. It's because of our own insecurities. It's not because of anything else. But my first Sunday that I did that, they gave me a mic pack and it had Andy's name still on it. And I was like, I do not need any more reminders, But I
I've
will
had
tell
that
you,
mic pack. It's so intimidating.
isn't it craziness? And
Yeah.
but I remember that first Sunday, Carey, in all vulnerability, man. I so remember preaching at North Point, and gosh, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people hear that, because of their broad reach. And I only really cared about one person hearing the message, who was, by the way, already going to heaven. And it didn't even matter that he heard it, but all I cared about was, what is Andy going to think?
Mm.
And it was such a gut check, and I didn't deal with it well for a while. It took me some time to get really comfortable in my own skin, being my own self, my own style, and allowing God to be responsible for the results. And if something happened next, that's okay. If nothing happened, that's okay. It took a long time. And by that, I mean, it probably took a couple of years to really work through that tension. And every time he would call, I would be worried, because, did he like it? And I've told him all this before, and he laughed about it with me. He's like, why did you feel that way? I was like, man, it wasn't your fault, Andy. It was all my fault. It's just my brokenness. But I admired you so much, man. I wanted your approval, and it took a lot of maturation for that to get out of myself, right? To get out of my heart. But I'm also so glad I had those experiences, because I don't know where I would be without it. Because, Carey, it's the squeeze that allowed me to recognize I had a lot of work to do. And that squeezed it out of me, and I had to figure it out.
So insecurity is an issue that I hear regularly from pastors. I would love to know how you got to the place where you felt that insecure. And I'm saying this as a fellow journeyer, not as an expert.
Yeah.
How did you go from the place of feeling that insecure to developing a reasonable level of confidence with your own voice and style, and just where you're like, yeah, no problem. I can have people who are better than me, theoretically, quote, on the same platform. It's not a problem. Because the reason I'm asking the question, Gavin, and I know you'll share this heart, is I'm convinced if we could scale that mountain as leaders in the church as a whole would be so much healthier.
Unbelievable. Well, I think part of the process for me, Carey, is recognizing that there is no end date in this. There isn't and I'm done and I am not insecure anymore.
Yes.
It really is like, that's why Paul talks about the renewing of our mind. It's not a renewed. There is no past tense to this. It's always a present tense. That's kind of the big realization for me, was that it's okay to acknowledge that is a driver in my heart, and I need to be aware of it. So it's a red flag. So what I learned to do is acknowledge that is in me. It's not it's a part of the brokenness of humanity, but it doesn't make me broken that I have that. So what I'm going to do is acknowledge that it's real, and I'm going to basically, like a dashboard on a car, pay attention to the gauges. And if something is showing a red flag, or if something is looking like the needle is getting close to empty, I'm going to feel that, and I'm not going to allow my insecurity to drive my behaviors. I'm going to call it what it is. I'm going to acknowledge it personally, and I'm going to allow myself as best I can to move past it. And if I don't feel like I can deal with it internally, I'm going to call some of my close friends. I'm going to talk to my counselor. I'm going to make sure this is something that I'm bringing into the light. I mean, this is everything that is in the dark gets grosser. The minute we expose it to light, it immediately begins to improve. So for me, really, it was bringing my own insecurity into the light and saying to myself, but also out loud, even to our church staff, to Andy, to my peers at the time, guys like Jeff Henderson, Clay Scroggins. Hey, this is something that I'm trying to figure out. I'm struggling with this. And it was for me, and again, this is my story on it. Maybe this isn't true for anyone else, but being honest about it started ridding my heart of it so quickly. And it allowed me to actually live out what I've been saying for years. God's responsible for the results, not me. I'm only responsible for doing my best. Everything else is on him. And so as long as I'm not mailing it in, as long as I'm trying, as long as I'm putting effort into it, I'm going to trust him with everything else. And then I started praying a prayer, because for me, it was mostly around stage stuff, right? It wasn't.
It wasn't around stage.
Again, that's not, but, and it's so public. Of course, that's going to be a place where it squeezes out our insecurity, I just started praying every single week. Every Sunday, I had the same prayer I prayed every single week before I went on stage. God, thank you for this opportunity. This is a privilege that you have given me. This is not about me. This is about you. I pray that I will do everything in my power today to get out of your way, and I'll just be a conduit. That's all I want to do. Mm-hmm. And it really freed me up to allow myself to be myself. And then ironically, or maybe not so, because of that, I became the better version of myself, because the striving version of me ain't that great of a version. But the who are you in this with God version of me is still sarcastic and still very challenging and entrepreneurial and all that, but from a place of hopefully health where I'm getting out of the way. It's like John the Baptist, more, less of me, more of him. That's just ongoing thought that I just have. And I still live with that every day. I mean, I'm traveling and preaching a lot now, and I'm on stages as much or more than I've ever been. And I'm still every week thinking that and praying that, as I walk out.
Yeah, and just to encourage leaders who are still struggling in that area, and I think you're right, it's struggling, not like, I have arrived. We haven't arrived.
Yeah.
But I think that idea, reps really helped. Like, to do it once is one thing, but when you've got consistently great people who are sharing leadership with you, or sharing a teaching role, or guesting on your podcast, et cetera, et cetera. I think I felt more secure as I realized, this isn't gonna, make me irrelevant, that I bring, and I've talked about this publicly before, but for me, it happened again, round 2, when I started doing more and more keynotes at bigger and bigger events. And, the person ahead of me was a hero of mine that I've read or studied or admired from afar for years. And I'm like, I'm not as funny as, I'm not as smart as, I'm not as interesting as. And then it finally hit me a couple of years ago, because I was like, I'm just the bullet point guy. But that's actually why they invited me. And then it finally dawned on me. It's like, the reason I'm different is the reason I'm here. And if I'm trying to be as funny as clever as coherent as clear as, then I'm not really being true to who I am. That doesn't give me an excuse for not bringing the best I can of myself. But the reps, the getting around other people who, in my estimation, are better than me, featuring them, spotlighting them, and then finally realizing, this is my unique little role, really helped. So I don't know. This is probably something people want to wind back 15 minutes and play again if you're struggling with that. And you haven't said it, so I'll say it. Not only you were a partner church, but you became a campus of North Point. When they saw your leadership, you were on the senior leadership team for many years at North Point, and you became a regular communicator at the broadcast location as well. So I mean, you had to work out your demons in the midst of that.
Well, I'll tell you what, though, the first half of that experience, I was doing it, and it was killing me internally. The second half of it, once I decided to work through all that and actually figure out what it was I even had to work through. I mean, that's the other part, right? You just know that there's tension. You don't know why or what's causing it. So it took some unearthing to figure that out. But on the other side of that, again, not the other side of having it fixed, but on the other side of recognizing what needed to be fixed, the amount of joy and just freedom I felt to be me and to bring my most healthy version of myself to the leadership, to the pastorate, to the stage, to the leadership team with Andy. I felt like I was so much more helpful to Andy and that team. I felt like I was such a better pastor. I was definitely a better communicator, One more very quick thing on that. This, I think, is a principle of life anyway, but it's hard to run away from something if you're not running to something else, right? So in our health, for instance, we can't say I'm going to run away from donuts because the focus is still donuts. Like, we need to put something else in place as the target. We need to run to something, not just away from something. So when it came to this level of insecurity, I couldn't just say, I'm going to run away from Andy being the end-all be-all evaluator. That wasn't helpful. So instead, I decided I'm going to run to God as the evaluator. Andy did a teaching on this, a leadership talk at our staff meeting forever and ever ago. But I think it was called an audience of one. But he basically talked about how, what if we were performing, but we were performing for an audience of one, of God, and that's it. And our only criteria of evaluation would be basically, God, what did you think about that? And that was the thing that finally unleashed it, I think, in the end for me. I just decided, hey, you know what, God, you're the one who put me here. I'm going to assume that you're the one who wants me here until you tell me otherwise. So I'm just going to do it for you and not anybody else. And you're the one who is responsible for changing lives anyway, not me. You're the one who's responsible for transformation. You're the one, it's all on you. So I'm just going to perform for you and perform in a healthy way. I know that can have a negative connotation, that word, but you know what I mean, Carey. I'm going to just do the thing that you put me here to do and let you take care of the results.
I love that framing. And, just to say it one more time for clarity, Andy never put that pressure on any of us.
Not ever.
But we all do it because we really respect people, we admire them, and everyone listening has probably got someone like that in their life that could be someone in their denomination, somebody that they get around, and it's just intimidating.
And in a healthy way too. God has used those people so much, and I think we want to be used that way. It isn't even all narcissistic or whatever. It's really even just us wanting to be used and wanting to, and again, all those things are up to God anyway.
Yeah. And to come out of a place of security is to know that you are loved, even if this flops.
Yep.
That you've got the unique gift set that I wanted you to have. Yep. And you're not as funny, as clever, as clear, as whatever. Okay, great. So
that's right.
But that's why I created you, right? And when you can get to that point where you're loved unconditionally, and I'm still getting there, it's a very, very different place to come at ministry and leadership from place of security.
I had a staff member, Carey, one time tell me, I bet it's sitting with me and said, I bet it would be amazing to work for Jeff Henderson. And I knew that I had made progress because my comment was, I bet you're right. I'd love to work for Jeff Henderson.
Everybody loves working for Jeff.
I didn't take it personally. I thought,
Oh, right. See, I thought about it that way, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's like.
I mean, I had a second, and then I thought, oh yeah, I know it's okay. It's okay. I love Jeff too. He's amazing, And so,
or when you get up there as a preacher and you have a team teaching, and it's like, so when's the next Jeff Brody series? When's the next Andy Stanley series? It's like, did you not just see that I preached my heart out? Come on, man.
There were so many times where people would quote something that I had said in a message and say, when Andy said, and then to quote my quote, it used to drive me crazy. And then I realized, you know what? I'm going to take that as a compliment, because if they think Andy said it, well, that's worth something. So
I have a friend, and sometimes if something I said gets appropriated or attributed to someone else, and I see it on social, I'll just take a screenshot and say, here we go again. And it's just a running joke between us.
Yeah.
But that's a good thing, I guess. Yeah. Hey, this is very therapeutic for a lot of people. I want to pick up the story though with Woodstock's, / Watermark. So 200 people, $400 in the bank. You come in, no theological training at that time.
Right.
You're charged with leadership. What were some of the first moves you made?
Well, I think we made some accidentally strategic moves. I was thinking about progress. I was thinking about how do we align everybody back to this mission, this vision that we say we care about. I didn't go about it always in the right way. I think my posture wasn't necessarily always perfect, for sure. But even though my heart was.
In what ways?
I'm just such a driver that people earlier in my leadership career were not a means. They were a means to an end. So we were getting a lot of stuff done with a wake of bodies behind us. For instance, you think about, I adopted a team of 4 FTEs, probably 5 total people on staff, and I'm brand new. I'm fired up. I'm excited. I am ready to go. They are exhausted, and they've been working so hard and watching diminishing returns, right, for a year or two. So, it's like strangers in the night. This is a terrible example, but it's a perfect analogy. It's when a person in a marriage comes clean about something, and it's like a weight has been lifted off their chest they've been carrying for years, and they feel better. Yet everybody else feels so much worse immediately.
That's a good analogy.
That's kind of how, I didn't think of it that way. I didn't see it that way. I just came in and basically I felt like I walked into the front door my first Sunday or first day and said, are you guys ready? Give me an R, we're ready. And meanwhile, they have been fighting to even stay above water. And so I don't think I handled that well. Now, the things that I think we did do well, we came out the very first Sunday and I just walked onto the stage and said, hey, my name's Gavin. I'm the new lead pastor. I'm so excited to be here. If you want to create a church that unchurched people love, you're going to love this place. If that's not what's exciting to you, I don't think you're going to like what we're going to do long term, because that's what we're going to do. That's our vision. And so we're going to work really hard to do that. And I would love for all of us to do it together. But, if that's not something that's exciting to you, I'd love to explain it more. But, this is probably not going to be a place you're going to love, That was smart, because we immediately set the expectation. And again, I don't know that I was as strategic as it sounds now, but because we had come out of a space where there was such a leadership vacuum before me, the guy that was the pastor before me was one of the most godly people I've ever met in my life, but just was also a reluctant pastor. He was the number 2 person for the first pastor who left, and basically just took the job, out of default, and learned, I think, that wasn't a good seat for him. He was a wonderful, number 2 kind of person. But he was thrust into this position and didn't even want it probably, and then was struggling with it. So I think I also maybe naively thought people would be more excited that I was there. Not that there was going to be a parade, Carey, but that people would be glad that a leader was here who wanted to lead. There's a phrase I use a lot now that, just because you were selected doesn't mean everybody selected you. And that's what happened. There was a hiring team that hired me, but the congregation wasn't a part of it. I just showed up, and, I'm expecting, I guess, everybody to be glad that I'm there. And I think some were, but not everybody. I think I missed the fact that I was going to have to gain some relational influence, that didn't just come with the title. The title gives positional authority, but in leadership, if Maxwell is right, and I think John Maxwell is probably right about all these things, it's ultimately about influence, which is a relational dynamic, not a positional one. And so, at least the best version of influence is going to come through relational influence, not through positional authority. And I don't know that I embrace that very well, but we did get some alignment around the mission and vision pretty quickly. And we made things better immediately. My first Sunday, we were 100% portable. I helped drag trailers at 5:30 in the morning and unload them all. We had 2 moving lights, and during our worship set, they just did circles on the ceiling, for 12 minutes. And so by next Sunday, I asked if we could do something more, and they said, sure. So then we did lines and circles, but it wasn't much better, but at least it was something, So we began to make immediate progress towards kind of this vision for what we wanted to create long term. Again, it was incremental. It was so small, but at least it was progress. And we celebrated it like we won the lottery, right? We celebrated it like it was Pentecost or something. But we wanted to, celebrate the direction of where we were heading. And it helped. And this, Carey, leaders are often great at painting a picture of the future, but most people can't understand something they've never seen. And so it wasn't enough to talk about the vision and paint a picture. We had to kind of show it. And so we began showing it incrementally. In fact, my second or third Sunday, I showed a baptism from the church I came from, not even from our church, just to show them what baptism could look like in the local church, because we hadn't had one in over a year, Yeah. And so just things like that, I think we did get right.
Well, it's interesting too, because you weren't trained as a preacher. I assume one of the things that didn't change, correct me if I'm wrong, is it wasn't like a new communicator showed up.
Right.
You hosted the services, you pressed play on the North Point series that were running at the time. So in many ways, I think a lot of us, and I would look back on my own leadership and go, oh yeah, I lead through communicating. It's a new day. You're communicating in a 3-minute block and a 90-second block, right? So I'm really curious, because I think a lot of us who are in a pastoral leadership role would just say, give me the microphone and go for 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn this whole thing around. You didn't have that freedom in the model you were in. So you changed the lights. What other changes did you make that were within your control to help see the turnaround?
Well, one of the things was preaching when we weren't showing Andy, because that was not happening much. So I did step in, but that's still 15 times a year. That's not nearly enough.
Not enough.
Not even close.
That you can't even say, oh, it was a change in communicator that turned everything
wasn't
around.
A change at all. I'll tell you what I really tried to work hard on doing is being omnipresent as a leader. I tried to be at everything, and even if I wasn't leading it, but my presence to be there. I also took the hosting roles, the vision spot roles, the dismissal roles, get 3 moments during a service where I could stand up and give a 2 to 4 minute moment. I worked so hard on making sure those were leadership driven moments, not just throwaway moments. I also wanted our church to know that we weren't just hitting play, that, I would say, for instance, really as the pastor here, it's part of my job to make sure that we're helping you grow spiritually. And so we've decided today to show you a message from Andy Stanley. We kind of treat him as our teaching pastor. I watched this already and knew that it would be helpful for you. So I want you to get help too. So just to be able to kind of let the church know that there is a rudder to the ship. There is somebody thinking about them, that's thinking about this organization, right? So that was one thing we did in those moments that I think were very, very critical. I also met with so many people one-on-one. I sat down with dozens and dozens. I mean, I can't say thousands. We didn't have that many people, but almost everybody who was willing to meet with me, I sat down and asked them 2 questions. What have you loved about Watermark Church, and what has frustrated you about Watermark Church? And because I knew that for me to lead well, I was going to have to gain trust. And trust is a combination of character and competency. You can't just have one or the other. So I had to show competency in leadership, which meant I had to do what I said I was going to do. We had to make some changes early on. I had to not just cast a vision, we had to execute on that vision so people could begin to see competency. But I also had to have high character. I had to put other people first. I had to listen really well. I had to be a person of integrity that they could see integrity in. So meeting with people gave me a one-on-one opportunity to gain trust with people, honestly, faster than I could have had I had that platform and pulpit every single Sunday. And so I did
that's true. Really changes your
individual meetings, a lot of individual meetings, and had to listen to some very harsh and difficult feedback about the church and even about me early on, but it's okay because it allowed me to gain some relational influence with some people and grow some trust with them.
When you think about that 3-minute welcome and the 90-second offering talk, I think you said something just in passing that I think is probably a little too true. A lot of communicators see those as filler or throwaway moments.
No.
What did you do? Because I know how much your colleagues and a lot of us prepared for those times. I'm not claiming I did as well as I could have or might do now. What did you do to leverage those 3 moments? 3 minutes.
Yeah. The first moment is that welcome moment. I'd like to associate the word orientation to it. I like to orient people to where we're going. knowing that they're walking in with some distinct emotions. Carey, when we worked at a church, we got there early and had easy parking and no traffic and whatever. The vast majority of people showing up had a completely different experience than we did. And so it was my job, I felt like, to make sure they felt wanted, warmed, and oriented to the day. So I would always explain what we were going to do today, about how long we were going to be here, when we were going to sing, what they could do as we sang. We have this fun phrase we use, assume they're in the room. But I assumed every week that someone was in that building giving God and the church one more shot. And I didn't want that to be lost on me or our leadership. So I took that 2 to 3 minutes and did not do announcements. We had, back in the day, we had a bulletin for that. Now we have digital spaces for that. The platform is not a good announcement space. Email and digital spaces are good for that. So I used it to orient people and to prepare them, to get them thinking emotionally where we were going. So orientation is what I did. The other thing I love about that space is when we talk to the guest every week that way, the vast majority of people in this room are not guests. But when we talk to the guest every week, I hoped it reminded everybody who did not bring a guest that they should be, because we designed this place for them and their friends. So I would talk about it that strategically, right, to help plant that seed. That offering moment, I associate the word inspiration to it. Every communicative moment we have is about application, right? We're not ever speaking just to speak. We're communicating to drive somebody to move, to take a step, to do something. And you know this, people will not take a step if they don't feel that they can take it and that it will be helpful if they do take it. So that offering moment is primarily about inspiration. We're trying to help people feel something emotional that will cause them to ponder, to be introspective, to consider what it would feel like or look like to do what we are asking them to consider doing. And I like that word consider. I would never say, we want you to give. I would say, I'd love for you to consider supporting your local church. I'd love for you to think about, because really that's what we're asking people to do. So we have to inspire them to do that. And then the dismissal space is his last kind of moment that we have in a hosting. I like to assign that, really is the word, it was like connection, or it's a reminder moment, but it's really about application. It's this last moment to go and do what we have been talking about. So we don't want to reteach the sermon or have another sermonette or whatever there, but it's our opportunity to almost maybe take personally what we've heard and then ask everybody to consider applying it in their life this week. So application is that final, step.
It's a beautiful framework: orientation, inspiration, and application. When you think about the journey from almost 0, 200 to 6, 7, 8,000, what were some inflection points, momentum boosters, where you're like, we've hit a tipping point?
Yeah. It's hard to pinpoint a specific number, Carey, right? You know that on that. I can't say it's 723 people. But I can tell you that when we got above 500, I quickly realized that my arms were not nearly broad enough to hold this thing. For me, it was about 400 to 500 is what it felt like, and it was probably even earlier, but I think I forced it longer. And the day that I got there, Carey, I felt like I had to take everything into my control. I felt like I had to get my grubby little hands around everything and control everything. And in some way I did need to for a minute, but I probably did it a little longer than I needed to. So around that 4-ish to 500 mark, I realized that I had to let go of some things, that I could not be in the know, be in charge, make every decision. I just couldn't do that anymore. I think another one of those moments was about 1,000 or so on a Sunday, where we hit a point where everybody felt like they knew me and I didn't know anybody. It was the first time I felt like our church got to a scale where I would walk down the street in our community and have people elbow point, come say hello, and I had never seen their face before. And that was so weird to embrace that. And it was awkward. I didn't know what to do with it. But and then again, I think when we probably hit about 2,000, from 1,000 to 2,000, I don't know that much changed about the way I was leading, but about 2,000 and up, it was just a never-ending conversation on how do we keep making good decisions to continue to allow for scale, right? So in structure, Carey, that's a little bit of my personal side of it. In structure, there were some other things that were happening. I remember when we were starting to grow, and some of my peers and at North Point said, "Hey, we need to, you probably need to hire an assistant." And I thought, what in the world am I going to possibly ask this individual to do? Like, I had no idea even how to have an assistant, And I didn't need one up until maybe 1,000 people or more, And even then, I wasn't so sure I needed one. But I learned quickly that trying to manage all of my calendar, it's just too much, to do by myself. And so, but I'm so grateful early on in those kind of scaling days. The thing that somebody told me this, and I can't remember who told me, I wish I could give them credit. But if we can start thinking like then is now before it's now, we'll be more prepared to get there. And if we can't think like then is now, we might never get to that then, because we may be the lid that keeps us from scaling. So one of the first things we did when we were a church of 250 is draw an org chart of what it would look like at 650. And my name was in 4 of the boxes, but I knew that as we grew, I could start looking at those different boxes and decide how I was going to give it away, who I was going to hire, contract, what volunteers we could bring in and give more responsibility to, things like that. So those kinds of kind of scalability moments for us became so critical.
So if you think about the inflection points around, 200, 400, which is 95% of all churches.
Correct.
What are the things you stopped doing or started doing at those 2 points?
Yeah, the things that when I first got there, I did everything, which was not smart. It was for a moment because I needed to understand everything.
It's like a plant.
I had to understand everything, but I needed to let go of some things too. So, I think the answer to that is a little bit unique based on each of our gift sets and our personalities and our passions and callings, right? As a pastor, for me, the things that I was uniquely gifted to do were strategy, adding intentionality to our service programming, to our entire discipleship pathway, communicating. So I was a constant up on the stage for that moment, even when I wasn't preaching, obviously. The things I wasn't made to do, which sounds terrible to say, but care, that was not my strength. And so outsourcing those kinds of things were critical for me up front. So outsourced care, ensured that I outsourced all of our KidMin, our student ministry programming, and let go of it. Had open-handedness to it, not just let go of it as in somebody was in charge of it, but I technically was still involved all the time. I mean, actually letting people, truly delegating it to people, So really it came down to what are all the things that have to be done for this place to be successful? What are the things that I'm uniquely gifted at doing? And then how do I get rid of all the other stuff? How do I delegate that? And whether it's high-level volunteers, which Carey, we talked about business leaders earlier, but I think I was pleasantly surprised. I should have known this before, but people often want responsibility and rise to the occasion when they understand the importance of the role and the opportunity. I think so many times we want to keep people from burning out, and it's an excuse for not asking people to engage in something that matters. And what I found is that there were lots of people who wanted to be involved and really wanted responsibility. And when I gave it to them, they were so grateful to have it and did an incredible job with it, right?
They ran with it.
Yeah, and the more I got out of the way, the better they did sometimes. And so I had to learn at that 200, at 400, and of course, some of those other inflection points to become more laser focused. I mean, you're a Swiss Army knife with 15 people in the room, right? But at 200, I needed to kind of get rid of some of those blades and just be a little bit more, stay in the lane that God uniquely built me to be in. And then at 400, I could get even less lanes and get even more focused on the thing that I was best at.
How did you deal with no longer knowing the people who are attending your church? I think that's a freak out point for a lot of leaders.
Yes.
Or if you're scaling a business, I knew every customer, I knew their spouses, I knew their pets' names. And for me, it happened around 600, 800, where I was just like, oh, my brain cells cannot contain the names and faces of all the people who are coming to our church anymore. And it hasn't ever corrected.
Right.
So how did you deal with that?
Well, there's an unhealthy answer to this too, for me. I in those earlier days, I was so progress oriented and people oriented. I don't want to say I didn't care, because I definitely cared, but it wasn't a focus, and it should have been more a focus for me.
Sure.
But so it helped me a little bit in that dichotomy. But my advice to leaders now, as I talk to people about that, is you never want to be the reason that you don't want to be the lid. Again, to use another John Maxwellism, but you don't want to be the lid for the scaling of your organization. And if you have to know everybody, you've automatically determined the size of this place. And so I decided that everybody needs to be known, but they don't have to be known by me. So let's really put a heavy emphasis on the connection and community aspects of what we're doing here. And even more so today than 20 years ago, right? I mean, this is not about content. This is not about information. This is about connection and community. We are going to elevate our small groups, elevate our connective opportunities. We're going to ensure that if you want to be known, there are plenty of places and people who can know you. I might not be that person, but lots of people will be. To your point though, the inflection point for me was when I realized that when people emailed me and said, I'd love to just pick your brain or grab coffee with you, I couldn't do it. I couldn't say yes, because there were other yeses. There's an opportunity cost to every yes, and the costs were too great. And I felt bad about that. I thought, what kind of leader of a church, by the way, isn't willing to meet with everybody who wants to meet with them? And I eventually realized the kind that wants to actually lead this place, and I had to start saying no. And it was hard. I came up with a few kind of, automatic replies where I would tweak, but, I would say, hey, if you could tell me a little bit more about what you want to talk about, I could probably point you in a better direction than me. Because it didn't take many of those pick your brain lunches to realize that they needed to meet with a care person, not me, or they needed to meet, and they wanted to maybe be on our worship team. And I'm like, I'm not the right person to ask about that, right? I've delegated that authority to somebody else. So so I had to get real kind of dogmatic and refuse to break the boundaries on some of those things that felt weird at first. But I also knew for us to grow and for me to be uniquely positioned to do what I'm actually kind of better at doing, I'm going to have those boundaries.
Well, did you encounter people who were disappointed that you couldn't meet with them the way you did when the church was a fraction of the size? And then what did they say? How did you deal with it?
Yeah. Some of those people left, honestly, Carey.
Honestly, that's what happens.
And there's nothing you can do about it. Somebody gave me some advice early on that don't fight to keep the disgruntled people around, because if they're going to be disgruntled, I mean, that's not going to create much energy in the positive.
Yes, you want gruntled people, not disgruntled people.
I want fully gruntled people. So, so with some of the people, I always tried in complete kindness to say, hey, I'm so sorry it feels that way. I hope you understand that, what we're trying to do, what my role is now, whatever. And not everybody could understand. But again, I tried to craft it through as much vision as I could and understanding. At the same time, I had to let go of that, rejection feeling when people were leaving because of those things, but realize that's just part of it. Again, I hate the mantra in a way that if everybody is happy, you're probably not leading well, but there is some truth to that. Like everybody can't be thrilled about every single thing that's happening in a growing organization. And I had to just become okay with that on some level.
I don't think people are happy with everything that's happening in a dying or stuck organization either.
So that's true too.
It's a really good
Carey.
point.
You're right, Carey. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So Gavin, first book. Is it your first book? I think
it is my first book.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Very, very honored to have had an opportunity to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, big shoes to fill. So what was the writing process like for you? Have a lot of authors / aspiring authors listening.
I have been blogging for a long time. I watched you do that, and I just thought that seems like a great way to. I love ideas, Carey, so much, and I just didn't have a platform for the idea. So I blog a lot because I love I love extroverting through the ideas through the written form. It's just fun to do it for me that way. So I after doing that for a long time, I decided with my experiences that maybe it's time to pursue the book thing. And so I started working with Zondervan on that and really thought about my experiences. I've had a few of these outside of just Watermark where I stepped into a leadership space that I didn't create, not a founder. And now I've inherited a team, inherited, in my case, a congregation, inherited cultures and systems. And how do you step into that and do it well? And as I began to think about it and do some research, Carey, I realized that every 3-4 years, people are changing jobs, which means that the dichotomy of stepping in is getting quicker. Expediting how we do that well becomes more important. So maybe that's something that there's a need in the marketplace to write about. So the process really was about me deciding, what is the research showing? What are the experts that have come before me? I mean, I've done it a little bit, but there are people who are dynamic and have done it before me, interviewed a bunch of those people to ask them questions about it and kind of put together a plan, a framework for stepping into a space without stepping in it.
Yeah. And I love how you pulled from different case studies and pretty high profile ones, because it's very easy to think about the small organization. On the other hand, Home Depot, Popeyes, Louisiana Kitchen, Coca-Cola. So you interviewed respectively Frank Blake, Cheryl Batchelder, David Katz of Coke. I mean, you think about it, you don't really think about the leadership transitions at Coke because it's been an iconic brand for 100 and some odd years, or Home Depot, which has been around, or big chain restaurants, but they happen all the time. What were some top lessons from some of those leaders? Yeah,
one was, and you know what's was so fun? I also interviewed a few people who were in smaller places, and I interviewed the guy who replaced me at Woodstock City Church, and so that was fun to get his perspective. So, one of the things I loved about it were how common the principles were. You know, leadership principles are principles. They're transferable. They may look different in some spaces, but they're principles. One of them was listening. Every one of these leaders talked about the power of listening first and listening deep into the organization. The people who are in these larger organizations like the Home Depots and Cokes and so forth talked about how you really, the day you become the boss is the last day you get the whole truth. And so the only way to really know what's going on is to listen deep into the organization. Cheryl Batchelder talked about doing a listening tour where she went to locations, Popeye's locations, and met with customers, met with cashiers, with frontline cooks, with the franchisees, So she wasn't getting the feedback about how things were going in the field from the field executive at corporate. She went and sat with customers, right? Same thing with Frank Blake. He learned what was actually happening in the store, not what the people who were running the store said was happening in the stores to him, right? Tinsley Almond, who you and I know, Tinsley became a CEO recently of a missions organization in Atlanta, a pretty large missions organization, Atlanta Mission. They do homeless work, things like that. He changed his title to CLO, Chief Learning Officer, for the first 4 months, and went through every experience that a care recipient goes through to understand what it actually feels like to interact with the organization, right? So listening deep in the organization was one. Change was an interesting one. They all had changes they needed to make. I wrote a lot about this on the blog and in the book because I'm fascinated by this, that every organization starts as an idea, Carey, but to scale has to be organized. And the minute we start organizing an idea, we create an organization. And the organization's primary goal is to make what currently is effective and efficient and fight against changing it.
That's so true.
It's such an interesting dichotomy, right? So Frank Blake talked about this, that every organization is probably able to change 2 to 3%, yet it's going to be much larger scale changes are going to be required, maybe even every month. I mean, change is happening so rapidly around us, right? So, think about this in the world of church, right? Everything we're doing is built for what was happening at some point. It could have been last week if you redid your ministry model, or it could have been 100 years ago. Who knows, right? But everything is orchestrated or organized to orchestrate what currently is. So
Mhm.
all of these leaders talked about how challenging it is to break out of the mold of what the organization is holding us to begin to think about what could be. And again, the minute you break out of it, if you can, you create a new innovation, a new process, a new ministry model, discipleship pathway, whatever. You would then immediately organize to it,
Mhm.
which creates another problem. So
Yep.
this battling of organization versus orchestration was something they all talked about that I loved. And then there's several more. I'll give you one more. Just the people element of this. It was so refreshing to hear these leaders talk about how shocked they are at how many leaders disregard the people in the organization. And that really got me thinking, because I was one of those leaders, I think, early on, who had a tendency to accidentally do that. And I realized that everything that we do in an organization happens with, in, and through people. There is nothing that's happening that doesn't involve people. And so Cheryl Batchelder had a quote. She said, you unlock performance when you unlock people. And that just really stuck with me, that people are the point. Now, they're also the problem, but they're the point. And so as a leader, it's our job to make them the point, right? To unlock their potential, to unlock them. And in doing so, we unlock all the other things we're hoping to have, like results and performance.
Those are such good lessons, and you've got a lot of them in the book. Cheryl Batchelder was actually on our podcast a number of episodes ago, and so we'll link to that in the show notes for you. But it's a masterclass in exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
And turned Popeyes from like probably not going to make it to a surging brand.
Yeah, so much so that they were purchased. I mean, because they were doing so well. I mean,
they got bought out by private equity.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Any other, time flies. Any other do's and don'ts for leaders who are stepping into shoes in the early years? You've reflected a lot on that, things you do differently. But one or two do's or don'ts for leaders who are stepping into big shoes.
Let's do a couple of don'ts really quick. Don't assume that you're the only one being affected by this, right? The entire organization is being affected. Do not assume that if you're replacing a poor leader or someone who came before you that wasn't as much beloved, that everybody is excited that you're here now. That's not how this is going to work out. And then one more kind of to don't. Don't forget that this moment is so ripe for tensions. There is an organizational tension happening. There are team tensions happening, and there are personal tensions happening. And this probably speaks a little bit to some of that insecurity we all have, but when you step into a new leadership role, you feel the weight of everybody watching you, the weight of everybody wondering what to expect from you, right? Our temptation is going to be to want to move too fast, to change things too quickly, to prove that we're competent, to prove that the interview team made the right choice, right? That's the wrong way to go about it. So on the other side of it, what should you do? You should listen a lot. You should step in with incredible empathy. The team has been going through a lot. This transition for them has been really hard on them. So to step in with a heart of empathy, a heart of understanding, ask questions of them. How has this been for you? What were some things about the previous leader that you really loved that you're afraid might be lost now? What are some things that you would love to see me do, maybe that weren't being done? And we're not trying to throw any sort of shade on the previous leader, but what could I do to make your job better? And another thing that I've really just heard over and over that I encourage leaders to do is ask the team to help them. I think one of the things we forget all the time is, we love to ask the question, and we should, how can I help you? But it's so empowering for other leaders when we say, can I give you some things that you could do to really help me? And so in these early days, to sit down with individuals and say to them, hey, here's something you can do to help me. Every time I get something wrong, say something wrong, or you feel maybe there's some tension bubbling up that I'm unaware of, will you please come to me and help me see that? Will you come to me personally and help me understand, because I'm new here. I don't understand this place that well yet, and you do, right? So recognizing, I think everybody wants you to succeed when you're a new leader, right? Everybody's pulling for you. They're afraid that you're not going to. So let's ask them to help you do it. Let's invite them into that so we can allow them to be a participant, right? Not just a casual observer who catches the shrapnel maybe from the decisions that we shouldn't have made or should have made.
No, that's really good advice. And I got to say, congrats. The book is actually very thoughtful and not predictable. You did an excellent job in putting it together. So the book is called Big Shoes to Fill. You can get it anywhere you get books. And Gavin, if people want to track with you, where's a really good place to do that right now?
Yeah, all the social media places, I'm on those, but probably the easiest way is just gavinadams.com.
Great. Gavin, what a riveting conversation. Thank you.
Hey, man. Thanks, Carey.